Bismillah walhamdulillah wa salatu wa salamu ala rasulillah wa ala alihi wa ashabih wa man tabi'ahum bi isanin ila yawmiddin. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. Welcome once again to another session of the great Imam al-Wāsiṭī rahimahullah ta'ala. We're looking at his life and legacy. Still, we're hanging out in Wāsiṭ. There's a lot happening, honestly. And in the rihla, I personally think so far, this part of the journey has maybe the most happening. So it takes quite a bit to get through it if you're not trying to rush, look at everything that he's highlighted and has critiqued. And then once we get past Wāsiṭ and we start moving into Iraq, etc., and we're going into Egypt, then things become a little bit more condensed, dealing with more manners, and we're actually going to dive into some aqeedah issues later on, beyond what we're looking at here. And so, if you remember, there was a section, because essentially we've read the entirety of this portion of his life in al-Wāsiṭ until he moves and goes to sit with the fuqaha of Iraq, ending up in Baghdad at some point. But during this portion of his rihla, there's a section there which he describes various different behaviors of his community, and a page at least is dedicated to these types of practices they would have that were related to graves. He documents a sequence of behavior, and it all has to do with visitation of the local shrine, Qubbatu Shaykh, okay? And when you look at it all together, and we're going to look at each individual act that he describes and understand the ruling of those acts as individual occurrences. But I think while we're doing that, we have to keep in mind that this, as a collective, formed a devotional system for them. It was something they did on the regular. And so the practices that he describes include organized travel to the shrine, ritual gestures. When the dome came into view, like removing head coverings, displaying emotional supplications, offering personal prayers, and physical acts at its threshold, that include prolonged standing and even prostration. The community treated certain features around the shrine as symbolic substitutes for pilgrimage rites, like making tawaf around a nearby pillar, and adopting forms of consecration resembling ihram. Some of them were reported to do that when approaching the site. Residents of the adjoining area engaged in devotional gazing toward the shrine. And then visitors from afar expressed reverence through offerings, vows, and acts of submission. Some individuals even developed elevated beliefs about the sheikh's ongoing influence over worldly affairs. And so as a whole, these series of events and, I should say, associated beliefs in some of them, their attitudes, etc., Imam al-Wāsiṭī viewed this entirety, if you will, of practices as bringing the practitioners to the very brink of disbelief. And I think that's important to emphasize that. He says that they almost left Islam, but nowhere in the rihla does he describe them as disbelievers. He doesn't say they left Islam. He says they got very close. It almost put them outside of Islam. So in this session, which is going to be kind of the beginning of what we could call a series within a series, very exciting stuff within this larger journey. And we've had a few stops along the way, have we not? We've had a few of these mini-series. There was one about singing and songs, etc. And then there was a mini-series within this series about controlling lust and desires, etc. So we're tracking along, and every once in a while we'll dip a little bit and then dip again to kind of deepen the engagement with Imam al-Wāsiṭī's legacy. And so what we're going to do in this mini-series, essentially, approaching these issues through the lens of the Hanbalī law, and adopting some of the spiritual understanding of the great scholars of the tradition, including Imam al-Wāsiṭī. Ground our discussions in the works that form the legal opinion of the school during that time, what we could call the Mu'tamid, if you will. And this is best represented by Ibn Qudāmah's works, al-Mughnī and al-Kāfī. Al-Kāfī in particular was the book that Imam al-Wāsiṭī summarized himself, having studied that with the great sheikh of his era in Damascus, we've discussed previously. So he would be very familiar with Imām Ibn Qudāmah's positions, legal rulings on issues pertaining to this very topic. And in the following sessions, of course tonight we're just going to look at the understanding of remembering death, visiting graves, and rulings directly related to that. And then we'll talk about, in the following sessions, the proper manners and etiquettes when handling the deceased, which is basically in preparation for their burial. And then what occurs right after burial. We'll also look at the relationship between the living and the dead, and how one should conduct themselves within the graveyard when visiting. And then we're going to discuss the Hanbali school's nuanced positions on tawassul. Tawassul meaning to seek a means through something in your prayers. We're going to look at the issue of istighatha, which means to seek aid or help, and also the claims, as he highlights, of at-tasarruf fil kawn, which basically is like cosmic influence of someone who has passed away upon creation. They have some type of influence or ability to manipulate or drive outcomes of things, and we'll discuss some of that. And what this will allow us to do by approaching these topics through this lens of a legal code, a legal tradition, is we will come out, inshallah, with clarity, balance, and fidelity to a tradition that Imam al-Wāsiṭī himself learned, inherited, and of course passed down through his works. And so before we get into the details of visiting graves, traveling, etc., first we need to understand where the Hanbali tradition typically begins when you discuss these topics. Scholars like Ibn Qudāmah often open the chapters of funerals, as that seems to be most related to death, dying, and what happens after that, by grounding the reader or the student in remembering death, dhikr al-maut. There's nothing that softens the heart more than remembering your priorities. And remembering death is a very quick way for you to recalibrate your moral compass. And remembering death, of course, is not a side note. It's not something to be overlooked. They mention it right away in the very beginning of these chapters, and that's what we're going to begin with here. And then we'll look at some of the proper etiquette and legal guidance that follows after that. So Imam Ibn Qudāmah in al-Kāfī, he begins and he says, it is recommended to increase in the remembrance of death. It's the very beginning of the chapter. And to prepare for it. And he mentions a ḥadīth from al-Barā. He's narrated, قال أمرنا رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم باتباع الجنازة وعيادة المريض. This is متفق عليه. It's recommended to increase in the remembrance of death and to prepare for it. For al-Barā narrated, the Messenger of Allah commanded us to follow the funeral, to follow after the funeral, and to visit the sick. And this is found in Sahih al-Bukhari and Muslim. And then you can find in al-Mughnī, if you understand Ibn Qudāmah's tier, he has an entire, he's like a madrasa, kamila, an entire school in and of even of himself in his works, writing works that were designed for beginners, intermediate, advanced, and then masters. And so when you look at here al-Kāfī, this is one of the more intermediate books of his. And then al-Mughnī, of course, is for the masters. So we're looking at both al-Kāfī, directly related to Imam al-Wāsiṭī, as we know for sure, documented as we can find in the history books. that he summarized that book into one volume, and then adding some depth from al-Mughnī. So in al-Mughnī, at the very beginning here, he also narrates another hadith in which the Prophet ﷺ, he says, أَكْثِرُ مِنْ ذِكْرِ هَذِمِ اللَّذَّاتِ فَمَا ذُكِرَ فِي كَثِيرٍ إِلَّا قَلَّلَهُ وَلَا فِي قَلِيلٍ إِلَّا كَثَّرَهُ. And this is found in Imam al-Bukhari's collection, at least the first part of that. So this is when the Prophet ﷺ said, increase in remembering the destroyer of pleasures. The destroyer of pleasures being death. For whenever it is mentioned amid abundance, it diminishes it. And whenever it is mentioned amid scarcity, it increases it. Again, found in Sahih Bukhari. So the narrations, both the first and the second that are mentioned by Ibn Qudāmah, one in al-Kāfī, and then both of them I believe you find in al-Mughnī, the Prophet ﷺ basically teaching us to remember the destroyer of pleasures, death, which brings balance back to a distracted heart. When we become overwhelmed with the dunya, remembering death is what will bring us back to focus. That it's not about this life, but it's about the next. And that's a lesson that is repeated throughout the Quran. The life of this world is fleeting, fading. It is an illusion of sorts. It is a temptation. It is a trial. It is trickery. It is deception that is used by shaitan. Whereas the hereafter is far better and everlasting. And so here, remembering death in this allows us to regain focus. And it also makes excessive moments feel small. When we become like distracted with the world and we can become overwhelmed with who has the biggest house and who has the nicest car and who has salary and whose clothes and how many wives do you have and how many children do you have, etc. When you say, كُلُّ نَفْسٍ ذَائِقَةُ الْمَوْتِ, every soul is going to taste death, you're like, what does it really matter at this point? What I have, it's all staying behind, as the Prophet ﷺ indicated. Everything's staying behind. All of that's going to be left behind. All you're going to go into the grave is with your iman, with your deeds. And then when you're overwhelmed with trial and tribulation, remembering death minimizes that. So it has a benefit on both ends of the spectrum. When you're overwhelmed, you feel like things are all coming undone and I'm going through the most difficult situations. You just remember, it'll all come to an end. Yeah. It'll be over soon. Yeah. You're struggling with your job. You're on the other side of that equation. The one person is boasting about all the things they have and they enjoy and the travel, the trips, the luxuries, the etc. And this guy's, I don't have any of that and I have a terrible relationship at home and my kids are just terrible and my job and my boss and my blah and everything. Then you just go, hey, it'll be over soon. And you just go, you're right. Just no big deal. We'll meet Allah soon. And relief will come. Relief will come. And so that is from the benefits of remembering death often, as is instructed by the Prophet ﷺ. So the practice here of remembering death, it's not about burdening a person, actually relieving them, providing a very strong spiritual anchor that keeps the believers grounded and aware of what truly matters. And so after we understand the beginning here of this section, if we look at this chapter, and the importance and the prophetic practice of remembering death in our daily lives, I think the next natural step is, by extension to that, remembering death, is where do you remember death the most? When you visit the graves. When you go and you visit a gravesite. Whether you're going because you are following a funeral procession and you're burying someone in your community perhaps, in your circle of friends, even closer in your family and relatives, you definitely are going to be remembering death in those moments. And this was a regular practice among the early Muslims. And again, it's not a ritual of doom and gloom, but it's a way to soften the heart and renew perspective. And it's also a means by which one can pray for those who preceded us, who are there, dead and buried. And so Ibn Qudāmah begins one of the sections in his book with this very topic, grounding the discussion in prophetic guidance, right? Which is one He gives us not only the manners, but also what one is to say when they enter the graveyard. And the supplications of the graveyard are also all about remembering death and preparing for it. So look at al-Kāfī again. Ibn Qudāmah, he says it's recommended for men to visit the graves, because the Prophet ﷺ, he said, "Kuntu nahaytukum an ziyarat al-qubur." I had forbidden you from visiting graves initially. فَزُورُوهَا إِنَّهَا تُذَكِّرُكُمْ الْمَوْتِ. But now visit them, for they remind you of death. And this is found in Sahih Muslim. So one of the unique things about this hadith of visiting the graves is it contains both a nasikh wal mansukh, right in one hadith. Right? Nasikh, mansukh means that which was abrogated, and that which is the abrogating trigger or factor. So initially the Prophet ﷺ forbade the companions from visiting the graves. And the understanding of this, in simple terms, is explained by the great scholars of the past, is that in the early years of Islam, the Muslim community, having just left behind certain practices of Jahiliyyah, that's pre-Islamic ignorance. There were customs that were tied to graves, like mourning. There were tribal displays, emotional practices that weren't healthy or spiritually sound. Okay? And so the Prophet ﷺ's initial ruling was to prohibit them from going there until the community would have some distance from those habits, strengthen their doctrine and their understanding, so that now the Prophet ﷺ said, I want you to go visit them because they remind you of death. Okay, he's now been able to empty those concepts and beliefs and practices and rebuild his ummah so that they could re-engage in a very beneficial and positive way with clarity and, of course, with the proper manners and guidance from the Prophet ﷺ. So again, once their hearts were firmly rooted in faith and in guidance of the Prophet ﷺ, he said, now visit them, for they remind you of death. And so this is a very, easy way to understand the general meaning of this particular hadith and how we can see the narration, I should say the tradition. These narrations show how the tradition of the Prophet ﷺ, or his sharia, developed over the course of his mission. And so if one passes by a graveyard or intentionally visits, this is what Ibn Qudāmah, he says, he should say what Muslim narrated. You can find this in his collection. As the Messenger of Allah ﷺ would teach them when they went out to the graveyards to say, Assalamu alaikum ahl al-diyar min al-mu'minin wal-muslimin wa insha Allahu bikum lahiqun nas'alullaha lana wa lakum al-afiyah. This is one of the supplications said when visiting the graves or passing by. Peace be upon you, dwellers of these abodes, believers and Muslims. Indeed, we will, if Allah wills, join you. We ask Allah for well-being for us and for you. Nas'allah lana wa lakum al-afiyah. We are asking Allah for well-being for us and for you. Meaning, and I want you to keep this in the back of your mind because it's going to come up later in an important discussion about the relationship between the living and the dead, is we're praying for afiyah for the deceased. Okay? Why would you do that? If you didn't believe that there was something happening to the deceased, if you thought it's just a lifeless lump buried in the dirt, decomposing, and there's nothing left, what well-being is there to be had? Think about that. Okay? Ponder over that. So we're asking not only for our well-being, those that are on top of the earth, but we're also asking for those that are just below, just a meter or two below our feet. We're asking for their well-being as well. Another hadith narrated, وَفِي حَدِيثٍ آخَرٍ يَرْحَمُ اللَّهُ الْمُسْتَقْدِمِينَ مِنَّا وَالْمُسْتَأْخِرِينَ. He says, may Allah have mercy on those who went before us and those who will come later. And in another narration, he says, اللهم لا تحرمنا أجرهم ولا تفتنا بعدهم وإن زاد الله مغفر لنا ولهم كان حسنا O Allah, do not deprive us from their reward, and do not test us after them. And if he adds, O Allah, forgive us and them, this is also good. So here are just a couple of supplications mentioned by Ibn Qudāmah. You can find these reported in various ḥadīth as to what you should say. And you can notice here, it's giving us, some manners, how we should approach the graveyards and how we should address those that we're basically addressing in a way, asking Allah and by way of addressing those that are deceased. We're praying for them. We're seeking Allah's mercy for them. And we're asking also, وَلَا تَحْرِمْنَا لَا تَحْرِمْنَا أَجْرَهُمْ, that we're not deprived of their reward. So this is a general recommendation for men. As for women, there are two narrations regarding whether it's disliked or not, according to Ibn Qudāmah. He highlights the first is it's not disliked for women to visit the graveyard. And this is due to the generality of the prophetic permission, as we found in this particular hadith. When he says, فَزُورُوهَا, he says, I want you to remember, I want you to visit because they will remind you of death. And because Aisha radiallahu anha visited the grave of her brother Abdurrahman. So this is the first opinion that Imām Ibn Qudāmah mentions in al-Kāfī. And al-Kāfī is all about inner madhab differences. That's that book. Whereas al-Mughnī will mention the other madhahib as well and their opinions. And then Ibn Qudāmah will surgically dismantle the opposing opinions to champion Imam Ahmad and the Hanbali. The second opinion is, he says, it's disliked for women to visit the graves because the Prophet ﷺ, he says, لَعَنَ اللَّهُ زَوَّارَاتِ الْقُبُورِ. Allah has cursed the women who frequently visit the graves. And this is an authentic hadith. So when the previous prohibition was lifted that we found in the first hadith about I prevented you or I restricted you from visiting, now go visit, and this was through the abrogation, the ruling of makruh or karaha here being disliked remained. So it was no longer prohibited, but it now became disliked, and this was for women in particular through the context of this particular hadith that was just mentioned. And there is some wisdom that the scholars use in order to explain perhaps why this is the case, as women tend to be, all right, وَالْحُكُمْ عَلَى الْغَالِبِ. We have to understand that rules are based on what's prevalent and not outliers, right? We can understand, we can agree that not every woman is the same, just like not every man is the same, right? We would say men are physically stronger than women. But that's not always the case, is it? There might be some really, really strong women out there that can overpower a man. But when we're talking about in general, we could pretty much agree, like, that's just the design of men and women physically. So like when it comes to sports, etc., having a man's playing a particular sport and a woman playing the same sport, and then having them compete together, and they've done that a few times, just for the sake of it. Could a woman beat a man in a sport? No doubt. But if you put them together and the skill level is like he's at the top of his game and she's at the top of her game, it could be a blowout. You're right. It could be a blowout for sure. Right? So here, we understand here that the general emotionality is very different when it comes to men and women. And so, women, in general, may find difficult at gravesides, especially when visiting loved ones. Imagine a child. A relationship the mother has with a child is often very different than the relationship that the father has with the child. Not to say that fathers are cold to their kids, but there's a certain depth that a woman has with her offspring. She's the one that carried them, nursed them, and more than likely, again, al-hukm al-ghalib is the one that raised them in their formative years. And so the connection that she has and the emotional disposition is going to create very, very difficult situations for her in those scenarios. And therefore, it could lead her to acting out in a way which is impermissible graveside. And so the Hanbali school, the mu'tamad here, the relied upon view, is that women visiting graves is considered makruh. Makruh, not haram. It's makruh, which means, in the language of the jurist, that you're rewarded if you don't, but not sinful if you do. Which basically means a woman could go and visit the graves. She won't be sinful for doing it, but avoiding it is preferred, based on some of the reasoning that I just mentioned, according to the great scholars. That ruling will shift to be haram when the woman knows that it will lead to prohibited behavior if she visits, like loud lamenting or striking herself, slapping at her cheeks or ripping at her clothing, or mixing with unrelated men in an inappropriate manner, or anything that violates the dignity of the deceased or the tranquility of the graveyard. Something that would be impermissible would change the ruling. If she knew that I'm going to go and this is what I'm going to end up doing, then she can't go. Okay? That gives you an idea of just some of the introductory concepts about visiting the graves, the importance and the spiritual benefit, and then that view of men versus women. All right? In general, everyone can go and visit the graves. Up to this point, I feel like, or at least I would understand from Ibn Qudāmah, we're talking about grave visitation in general and the basic sunnah of remembering death, like offering salam, making dua for the deceased, maintaining the graveyard, etc., and maintaining the manners, I should say, of the graveyard, etc. The next topic, which is an important one, and mentioned, it's the first thing mentioned by Imam al-Wāsiṭī in his rihla here, is rihla. It's exactly that. Rihla means a journey. So when we're talking about this topic of journeying to visit graves, traveling for visitation, the jurists, they become very particular and very specific. And they look at a number of different angles here. Distinguish between ordinary visitation, traveling for reflection, traveling to pray in blessed places, and traveling with spiritual intentions. Right? And this is what Imam al-Wāsiṭī, he noticed, of course, in his community in Iraq, in al-Wāsiṭ, and perhaps he would note elsewhere throughout his travels. People visiting different graves, sometimes traveling, whether it's a short travel or a long travel. Travel is pretty much a one and the same. It's not like your local graveyard. So that was the very first line of this is, he said, when I was a kid, we used to travel. They would take me, and as I would go with them, and we would travel to visit Qubbat al-Shaykh. We would go and visit the shrine of the Shaykh. So again, we turn to the foundational Hanbali texts, al-Kāfī and al-Mughnī, and we're going to outline here the classic ruling on travel. First, we're going to start with getting a baseline understanding of travel and some associated rulings with that. And some of you will recognize these right away, especially those that have been attending the Bidayat al-Abid class, or if you remember some of the Umdat al-Talib when it came to this particular topic, looking at travel and rulings pertaining to it, its categories. We're going to talk about rukhsa, which is concessions. Many love to shorten and combine prayer while on a journey. And this will help us get a clear picture about some of these recommendations when it comes to visiting a grave and how this applies. Okay, so let's check it out here in al-Kāfī. This is, of course, I stress this point. This would be what the mu'tamad of the Hanabila would rely upon here during this period of time. Ibn Qudāmah, remember, he passed away in 620. Imam al-Wāsiṭī passes away in 711. Okay, so we're right in this middle era of the school. So we understand that travel carries specific rulings, permissions, and restrictions depending on one's purpose. So here, if we look at Imām Ibn Qudāmah, beginning with the foundational principle that travel itself is categorized, and the concessions that come with travel, like Shortening the prayer is one concession. Another concession is joining prayers together, Dhuhr and Asr and Maghrib with Isha. Another concession is wiping over the socks for 3 days while underway. Breaking the fast is another concession related to travel. And praying voluntary prayers on a riding animal or on a vehicle. These are concessions that all depend on the nature of the journey. So that means we have to categorize types of journeys and various different rulings to determine whether we can actually apply these concessions. That's right. You can't shorten and combine your prayer or wipe over your socks for 3 days unless the nature of the travel permits you to do that. And that's what Imām Ibn Qudāmah explains, that the rukhsa, they apply in any journey that is either wajib, mandub, or mubah. That means obligatory, mandub is recommended or mustahab, or simply permitted. It's simply allowed. And that includes things like going for hajj, performing umrah, you have to travel for, traveling to seek knowledge, traveling for business purposes, trade and commerce, visiting relatives, or any other upright purpose. The point is that the long journey itself, if it's not sinful, then the person may take the concessions of the traveler. The opposite, he explains this, the opposite, these concessions are not granted in a journey of sin, like escaping an obligation. Someone says, look, I'm tired of fasting today in Ramadan. I'm just going to take a little trip, take a little journey. And because I know you get concessions when you travel, and so I'm going to take me a little day trip. I'm going to ride down to, I don't know, maybe I'm going to ride up to Maine and I'm going to get some lobster boats, you know. Instead of going to the truck, you know, the food truck, Maine lobster. I'm going to go all the way to Maine itself for the day, because I can hit that and maybe, and come back and get some lobster boats, you know, with some mayonnaise. It's good stuff. So that's escaping an obligation. You're traveling for the intent of breaking your fast. In that case, it's not permissible. It's not permissible. The journey's not permissible, and breaking your fast is not permissible either. So it's a double whammy in that case. Not permitted to do that. These concessions are given and granted to assist a believer in carrying out something permitted, and not granted to help facilitate sin. And this reflects a deeper principle in the school, and that is the rulings of travel follow the nature of the journey. So if the purpose is upright, the rukhsa applies. If the purpose is sinful, they do not. All right, so that was just an introductory thing. And that really comes down to your intention. And the nature of the travel can change if the intention changes even midway. You start off with one intention and you change it mid-travel, the whole thing changes altogether based on that intention. So if you started off with a permissible journey and then halfway through you go, oh, I got another intention that comes into mind that's going to take me off course into some haram things, the nature of that journey now has changed altogether. And the rulings of those concessions now are built on the intention that you've just established. Right? So it is all about the intent behind the journey in order to establish the ruling of the journey itself. So that's what framework we need to understand. We need to be thinking in terms of the legal framework and the mind of a jurist, as opposed to maybe an emotional reaction to some of these things. How might we respond emotionally? Some of us may be trained to think in a certain way. But emotions are not going to get us where we want to be. We want clarity, right? We want purpose. And we want to attach ourselves to the tradition in a very, very authentic way. So again, specific question here. What if someone travels to visit graves or shrines? And this is dealt with by Ibn Qudāmah. Does this count as a valid journey? And that brings us to the first core passage you'll find on the topic, and this is found in al-Mughnī. He says, فَصْلٌ فَإِنْ سَافَرَ لِزِيَارَةِ الْقُبُورِ وَالْمَشَاهِدِ. So what do we understand from that? We're talking about a section, and this is in Kitab as-Salah, by the way, in case you're interested to read up on it. He says, if you travel to visit al-Qubur, which are graves, and mashahid are like shrines or particular places, right? There's something associated with that place. It's typically like a shrine. قال ابن عقيل, Ibn Aqil, he says, he quotes Ibn Aqil right away, لا يباح له الترخص لأنه منهي عن السفر إليها. قال النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم لا تشد الرحال إلا إلى 3 مساجد متفق عليه. So he says, Ibn Aqil said, he's not permitted to take the concessions of travel because such travel has been prohibited. The Prophet ﷺ said, no saddles are to be packed. This is shaddur rihal, except to 3 masajid, 3 masjids. And we're talking about what? Masjid al-Haram in Mecca, Masjid Nabawi in Medina, and Masjid al-Aqsa. And you find this muttafaqun alayh. This hadith is utilized by Ibn Aqil and others. Ibn Qudāmah, he goes on and he says, وَالصَّحِيحُ إِبَاحَتُهُ وَجَوَازَ الْقَصْرِ فِيهِ لأن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم كان يأتي قباء راكبا وماشيا وكان يزور القبور وقال زوروها تذكركم الآخرة. وأما قوله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا تشد الرحال إلا إلى 3 مساجد فيحمل على نفي التفضيل لا على التحريم وليست الفضيلة شرطا في إباحة القصر فلا يضر انتفاؤها. He says, but the correct view is that such travel is permitted and that shortening the prayer is allowed because the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam, what's that face you're giving me, used to visit Quba, riding and walking, and he used to visit the graves. And he said, visit them, for they remind you of the hereafter. And for his statement, no saddles are to be packed except to 3 masjids, it is understood to mean the denial of superiority, meaning that these 3 masjids are uniquely virtuous, not to mean prohibition, meaning you can travel to other places besides just traveling to these 3 masjids. لا تشد الرحال إلا إلى 3 مساجد. Do not travel except to these 3 masjids. You mean we can't travel any other place? I can't visit any other masjid by way of a journey? Or any other thing? So the hadith he's saying here is meant to deny superiority, meaning traveling for the purposes that this one is better than the one that I have. I believe this masjid is more virtuous than the one that's in my local region. Maybe I just want to go for another purpose. I just want to go check it out. I don't believe that there's any virtue beyond what's here because I understand the 3 masjids are the ones that are virtuous and that have a special rank above all other masjids or all other places. So that's essentially the understanding of Ibn Qudāmah and many of the other great scholars, not only in the Hanbali tradition, but also the various other schools. So again, superiority, he says, and superiority is not a condition for the permissibility of shortening the prayer. So the absence of such superiority does not affect its allowance. So the passage is important here with Ibn Qudāmah, and there are several reasons. First, it shows that Ibn Qudāmah directly acknowledges the opposing view of Ibn Aqil. But then he explicitly rejects it, highlighting there is a view out there which prohibits this type of journey and travel. Meaning you can't go visiting graves by way of journey. They're not denying visiting graves. They're just saying you got to keep it local. You can't travel. And they're using this particular hadith. See here, both sides of the argument using the same hadith. One for and one against. Or one not for, one he's saying it doesn't apply in this scenario. One's using the hadith, so you can't do it. And he's saying, no, that's not the appropriate usage of the hadith. And this is what you find often in fiqh, where you find a difference of opinion. The notion that the imams, like one of them has the hadith that the other doesn't have. Like they knew more and this one didn't. The notion that that's the case is very, very rare. It's very rare, almost unheard of, that one imam doesn't know the hadith and this one does. Maybe you'll find that. But typically, these differences, they're aware of the same hadith, using the same verses from the Quran even, but then arriving to different conclusions based on various principles that they're utilizing, an understanding of the words of either Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala or of the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. And so you're going to end up coming to a variety of different conclusions. Okay? So here we can see he mentions this opposing view and then of course rejects that. And he's not rejecting it on emotional grounds, but he's rejecting it through reasoning and prophetic precedent. The Prophet said, I used to prohibit you from the graves, but now go visit them because they remind you of death. And there's nothing explicit about him restricting that to your local graveyard. There's nothing there that's explicit in those ahadith. He says, but don't travel to do that. We're having to come to some, if we want to restrict it, we're having to utilize unrelated, if you will, instruction, which is why this hadith is mentioned about shadd al-rihal, packing the saddles and traveling. And that's talking about the masajid first and foremost. Okay, so basically we're saying we don't have explicit information or instruction to restrict visitation of the graves by way of travel. And then of course he mentions the other precedent of that is the Prophet ﷺ traveled to Quba. And while we're thinking about it today, Quba is very much a part of Medina, but during that time it was not considered Medina proper. Right? Quba was outside of the city. You had to leave the city limits at that time to get to Masjid Quba. And that's like a day trip. It's considered a short travel, but it's still travel nonetheless. And going to Masjid Quba was done for devotional purposes. The Prophet ﷺ used to go there weekly. And he also mentioned the Prophet ﷺ would visit the graves. So he says essentially concluding that traveling or ziyārah, visiting the graves, traveling for visitation is permissible, and therefore the concessions of travel will apply. And we've understood that the concessions only apply for wajib, mandub, or mubah travel. And therefore, this is among those categories. As he says, it's permissible. Okay? وَالصَّحِيحُ إِبَاحَتُهُ. What is the correct view is its permissibility. What's the permissibility? As he says, فَإِنْ سَافَرَ, the beginning of the section, فَإِنْ سَافَرَ لِزِيَارَةِ الْقُبُورِ وَالْمَشَاهِدِ. Traveling to the graves and the shrines. Permissible. Remember, the intention is important here. So what are you going to travel to the grave and the mashahid for? The permissible, even the recommended, if you will, to remember the hereafter, to pray for the deceased, etc. Going there to do something impermissible, would that change the nature of the travel or not? Yeah, it would change based on the legal framework that we're utilizing. Then we might be looking at a different ruling of the travel altogether. Essentially, what I'm trying to establish is a baseline. What is our baseline? Because not everybody that goes to a graveyard is going there for impermissible reasons. In fact, I would say most people that go to the graveyard are going there to visit a relative, perhaps, to say salam or to pray for that relative, or to take care of the grave, to maintain and manage. Okay, so if we were to say, look, you can't travel to graves altogether for these types of reasons because you could potentially, that's not the case. That's just not the case, right? And we will, of course, address some of the issues that he mentions later that I think some people, they recoil when they hear these things, and rightfully so in some cases. However, here we're talking about permissible travel to visit the graves and to visit the shrines. And this basically sets us up for the next topic related to this. And that's not just visiting any grave, but visiting the most honored and blessed in Islam, and that is the grave of the Prophet sallallahu alaihi wasallam. There's a very different ruling when it comes to this. We just said visiting the graves in general, and the mashahid is mubah. It's permissible. Ibn Qudāmah, he says, يستحب زيارة قبر النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم وصاحبيه رضي الله عنهما لما روي أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال من زارني أو زار قبري كنت له شفيعا أو شهيدا رواه أبو داود. Another one says, and he goes on, he says, ويصلي في مشتد رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم لقول النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم صلاة في مسجد هذا خير من ألف صلاة فيما سواه من المساجد إلا المسجد الحرام. وقوله صلى الله عليه وسلم لا تشد الرحال إلا إلى ثلاثة مساجد المسجد الحرام ومسجد هذا والمسجد الأقصى متفق عليه. So here, this portion right here, and I believe you find this in al-Kāfī. Yes, you find this in al-Kāfī. It's recommended to visit the grave of the Prophet. Recommended. We're now elevated, escalated, if you will, from being mubah to visiting graves. Now it's being recommended to visit the grave of the Prophet and the graves of his two companions. So not just the Prophet, but his two companions, to visit both of them. And he says, because it's narrated, the Prophet ﷺ said, whoever visits me or visits my grave, I will be his intercessor or his witness. And this is narrated in Sunnah Abi Dawud. One should pray in the masjid of the Messenger of Allah, because the Prophet ﷺ said, a prayer in my masjid is better than 1,000 prayers in any other masjid except the sacred masjid. And he said, no saddles are to be packed except to these three masjids. The sacred Masjid al-Haram, that's in Mecca, Masjid of mine in Medina, and al-Masjid al-Aqsa. This is, again, muttafaqun alayh. It's a hadith we already mentioned when it came to the general visitation of graves and traveling to do so. In al-Mughnī, he says, فَصْلٌ وَيُسْتَحَبُّ زِيَارَةُ قَبْرِ النَّبِي. Right? So in al-Kāfī, he says it's recommended. Al-Mughnī, of course, it's going to be the same thing. يُسْتَحَبُّ زِيَارَةُ قَبْرِ النَّبِي لِمَا رَوَى الدَّارُقُطْنِي. And the reason why I am bringing this to your attention, because there's another hadith. He says it is recommended to visit the grave of the Prophet ﷺ, based on what was narrated by ad-Dāraqutnī. And the narration or the chain of it is on Ibn Umar. قال رسول الله صلى الله عليه وسلم من حج فزار قبري بعد وفاتي فكأنما زارني في حياتي. وفي رواية من زار قبري وجبت له شفاعتي. Listen to this. He said, the Prophet ﷺ, he says, من حج, whoever makes hajj, فَزَارَ قَبْرِي بَعْدَ وَفَاتِي, and then visits my grave after my passing, it's as if he is visiting me while I'm alive. Visiting me while alive. I should say, زَارَنِي فِي كَأَنَّمَا زَارَنِي فِي حَيَاتِي. It's as if he has visited me during my life. And then another narration, it says, whoever visits my grave, وَجَبَتْ لَهُ شَفَاعَتِي. My intercession will be obligatory for that person that visits the grave. And we should all understand the nature of the shafa'ah, the great intercession, for the qiyamah, for after that. The Prophet ﷺ has been given shafa'ah. And we all ask that we are among those that he intercedes for. Right? So this is an important element to that, a means by which that will be granted. And so it's something that should be taken advantage of. And therefore, based on these ahadith, yustahabbu. Okay, it's considered, as he says, recommended to visit the grave. وقال أحمد في رواية عبد الله عن يزيد ابن قسيط عن أبي هريرة أن النبي صلى الله عليه وسلم قال ما من أحد يسلم علي عند قبري إلا رد الله علي روحي حتى أرد عليه السلام. He says it's recommended here. After this recommendation part, he mentions a narration from Imam Ahmad. He said in the narration of Abdullah from Yazid ibn Qusayt, from Abu Hurairah, the Prophet ﷺ said, no one sends salam upon me at my grave, except that Allah returns my soul to me until I reply to His salam. Remember this portion. Not only is it very powerful in this relationship, this is what I was alluding to earlier. What's the connection between the living and the dead? What's the relationship between the living and the dead? Because, I mean, in worldly terms, we think the only relationship is that the person's dead in the grave and there's nothing that can be said about it. I mean, they're gone, they're deceased, their past is over, finished, nothing, not. I could sit there and talk to them at their grave. They're not hearing anything because they're dead. But look at this situation here. The Prophet ﷺ is telling us, he's saying, إِلَّا رَدَّ اللَّهُ عَلَيَّ رُوحِي, except that Allah will return my soul حَتَّى أَرُدَّ عَلَيْهِ salam, until I can respond to him by giving him salam in return. Right? Many of us are saying things like, if only I was alive during the Prophet's time, I just would give anything to be alive just to say salam or just to be in his presence. Here you go. Go visit the qabr and say salam. Because he says, مَا مِنْ أَحَدٍ يُسَلِّمُ عَلَيَّ عِنْدَ قَبْرِي. No one says salam to me at my grave, except that Allah will return my soul so that I can respond to that salam. There's your salam to the Prophet. Right there. It's as if he was alive. I should say, it's as if he was alive on the top of the face of the earth. Because obviously there's some type of life that's happening in his grave. Another note, I think that's important here, as we get close to the end here of this topic. In later works in the development of the school, Kashaf al-Qina'ah, a great book I've been mentioning before by Imam al-Buhuti. It's an explanation of al-Iqna'ah. The author mentions the following. He says, Tanbihun, this is in the same chapter, about visiting the Prophet's grave. Tanbihun, qala Ibn Nasrillah, لازم استحباب زيارة قبره صلى الله عليه وسلم استحباب شد الرحال إليها لأن زيارته للحج بعد حجه لا تمكن بدون شد الرحل فهذا كالصريح باستحباب شد الرحل لزيارته صلى الله عليه وسلم. So one of the great scholars this is after Ibn Qudāmah, of course, after Ibn Taymiyyah, even Ibn Nasrillah, that's an important point here. He said the necessary implication of the recommendation to visit his grave, alayhi salatu wasalam, is the recommendation to undertake the journey to it, because the pilgrim's visitation after completing his Hajj cannot be achieved without traveling. Where are you? You're in Mecca after your Hajj. And if it's recommended to visit the grave, what do you have to do? You got to travel. You got to leave. Traveling, that's a whole journey. No doubt about it. That's a journey in and of itself. So this is effectively, Ibn Nasrillah, an explicit statement that traveling to visit him, alayhi salatu wasalam, is recommended. وقال ابن نصر الله في هذا إن الزيارة أفضل من حج التطوع وإن حج الفرض أفضل منها. He says, Ibn Nasrillah, in this context, indeed the ziyarah to the Prophet's grave is superior to a voluntary Hajj, while the obligatory Hajj remains superior to it, meaning superior to the ziyarah to the Prophet alayhi salatu wasalam. All right, so hearing these statements like this from Ibn Nasrillah and the various conclusions of Imām Ibn Qudāmah based on the great madhab of Imam Ahmad, becomes quite clear that there has always been another way of looking at this issue of shaddur rihal, traveling to visit graves and shrines. And this is a view held by some of the later thinkers. Not only the earlier scholars of the school, very early this was a non-issue, but also those that came later on. But the opposing view argued this, almost the reverse of it. They claim that if a person sets out specifically to visit the Prophet's grave, then that type of travel is not legislated. Because, as we've seen, in their reading, the hadith of no saddling mounts except to 3 masjids blocks any journey that is not strictly for prayer in a masjid. And they extended this further. If someone travels but frames their intention as ziyarah rather than salah, their journey becomes questionable altogether, even though the destination is the Prophet's own city. The Hanbali tradition from the era of Ibn Qudāmah onward, we could say prior to Ibn Qudāmah leading, because Ibn Qudāmah doesn't make up the madhab, by the way. Ibn Qudāmah is not where the madhab started. And Ibn Qudāmah is not constructing the madhab out of thin air, but he is relating the tradition of the madhab all the way up through the latter scholars like Ibn Nasrallah, all the way to Imām al-Bahuti, who all through the book Kashaf al-Qinā, he narrates from Ibn Nasrallah. They understood the matter entirely different. For them, ziyārah and prayer were not competing intentions. To travel for ziyārah or to travel for prayer, but were mutually reinforcing. So you could enter Medina with the intention to visit the Messenger and naturally pray in the masjid. Or you could enter with the intention to pray and then naturally visit the Prophet ﷺ. So you could go to Medina intending to visit the Messenger and not pray. You visited and you got to get back on the road. You came in at an odd time. You got to keep it moving. Just enough time to stop, visit the Prophet, and go. All right? So there's no harm, no foul in doing that. In fact, according to the school, it's recommended. Either direction of the intention is valid, sound, and certainly spiritually coherent. And Ibn Nasrallah points out that once ziyarah itself is recommended, as we've established by way of Ibn Qudāmah, the travel required to perform it carries the exact same ruling as we've understood about purification for prayer. Right? What is required to complete an obligation is itself an obligation. Right? We understand that principle. That's another way of thinking in the jurist mind. Right? If something is required to complete an obligation, then that thing is an obligation. And because visiting the masjid required, or visiting the Prophet's grave is for the Hajj, the pilgrim, travel is needed, then the travel becomes it becomes recommended itself as the means to achieve that recommendation. And so this is why the Hanbali school, in that school, these discussions, they never treat ziyarah as an intrusion into the masjid's virtue, but as one of the noblest reasons for a believer to find themselves at the masjid's doors and to enter so that they can visit the Prophet ﷺ. So when we take a step back from all of this, all the details, etc., the scaffolding that I put together in order for us to understand and arrive to this conclusion, hopefully at a neutral kind of emotional baseline. Okay, I recognize that the topic is one for many that is quite charged. It's a hot topic. Shaddul Rihal. To other masjids, let alone to a grave. The grave of the Prophet ﷺ, let alone to other graves. Okay? I recognize the nature, the sensitive nature of the topic. And I say sensitive nature not because the issue is a problematic one, but because of what has surrounded it by way of argumentation. You can see, even from the great imams, Ibn Aqil, etc., Ibn Taymiyyah has a particular position on this, about traveling to graves, traveling to masjids, etc. But the one thing that I think is important for us to note is that when we're talking about the madhab, it is what it is. Right? It is what it is. And you can't lay something over it to conceal it. You can't cover it with a different wrapper and say, this is the Hanbali way, and you've put a wrapper over it or a different label on it. Right? No. You have to call it for what it is. If you like it, you do. You like it. If you don't like it, you don't have to like it. It is what it is. And I think that the argument for it is very strong. And this is how they dealt with it. So essentially here, when we look at this from Imam al-Wāsiṭī's view, looking at, if we were to consider this the backbone of the school, Ibn Qudāmah's works, as he studied them, we would understand a conclusion, and that is, remember death often. Visit the graves. That's a way in which you can remember death. And take from those moments when visiting the graves, whether it's your local graveyard or you've traveled there to visit for whatever reason that may be, whether it's to the Prophet ﷺ or to another graveyard, You have to take those moments to help gain some deep awareness of the hereafter. And of course, when the question arose about traveling for ziyarah, and Ibn Qudāmah obviously dealt with it in his book, they would analyze it in this manner, looking at the prophetic precedent, looking at the intention of the traveler, looking at the purpose, and of course the soundness of one's conduct when they get there. And so the rukhsa of travel applies to these journeys, as we can see, because they're permissible or they're recommended to the Prophet ﷺ. And when we're discussing these, amongst the school, you won't find the imams of the tradition labeling such travel as bid'ah, as shirk, or as haram. As a baseline, they wouldn't even say, this is an avenue to shirk. They don't describe it like that. Right? They've understood it in a completely different way. Distinguished the sound ziyarah, which is rooted in reverence, prayer, remembrance, versus excess, exaggerations, and deviations that some people fall into. But again, we're not basing our rules on the outliers. We're basing it on the general populace. And this is where we can wrap up for this evening. Jazakallah khair. So we just talked a little bit about ziyarah, traveling for visiting graves, etc., and the basic understanding of why we should visit graves, and so on and so forth. And as we push forward in the next sessions, we're going to be looking at some of the manners of visiting the graveyard, dealing with the deceased, and as I mentioned, some more sensitive, even more hotter topics in today's Muslim world about tawassul. We'll also look at tabarruk, seeking the barakah and istighatha. Jazakallah khair. Wa sallallahu wa sallam ala nabiyyina Muhammad wa akhiru da'wana. Alhamdulillahi rabbil alamin.